I walked away from our 7-year marriage with nothing but the clothes on my back, letting my ex-husband believe he had won. He laughed when I told him I was moving to a quiet seaside town, thinking I was destined for failure. He had no idea I was sitting on a hidden empire. It took a stranger crashing his extravagant wedding reception to finally wipe that smug look off his face and expose the ruin awaiting him. My name is Elena, and I was sitting at the corner table of Luciano's, the most pretentiously expensive Italian restaurant in downtown Chicago. This was the exact spot where Marcus and I had toasted to his first major promotion, and where we had celebrated our 3rd anniversary with vintage wine and whispered promises. Back then, the flickering candlelight had seemed romantic, casting a soft, golden glow over what I thought was a bright future. Tonight, however, the heavy velvet drapes and the hushed, reverent atmosphere felt suffocating, like a funeral parlor prepared for the burial of our 7 years together. Marcus arrived 20 minutes late. He offered no apology as he slid into the booth opposite me. He was dressed in a bespoke navy suit that I knew cost $3,000, a sartorial shout for attention that screamed insecurity more than success. He barely acknowledged my presence. His eyes were fixed on the glowing screen of his phone, his thumbs flying across the glass with frantic energy. A boyish, foolish grin plastered his face as he typed. He was texting Tiffany. I knew it. He knew I knew it, and neither of us pretended otherwise. I watched the man I had once vowed to love until death parted us. I searched my heart for the crushing weight of heartbreak I had carried for the last few months, but I found nothing. The agony had evaporated, replaced by a cold, clinical observation. He looked ridiculous. The way he preened at his reflection in the silverware, the way he ignored his wife to fawn over a mistress he had known for barely 6 months. It was not tragic anymore. It was pathetic. I felt a laugh bubbling in my chest, but I swallowed it down with a sip of water. The realization washed over me that his indifference could no longer hurt me. It only made me feel light. The wedding is going to be massive, Elena, he finally said, not bothering with pleasantries as he shoved his phone into his pocket. He waved a breadstick like a conductor's baton. Tiffany wants the plaza. She has vision. She knows how to make a man feel important, how to make him look good in public. Unlike you always wanted to stay in, hide away. It was suffocating. A man like me needs a woman who shines. I carefully folded my napkin, smoothing out the creases with deliberate slowness. I am happy for you, Marcus, I said, and his eyes narrowed, searching my face for sarcasm. He found none. Once the papers are finalized this week, I am leaving Chicago. I am moving to Harper's Cove. Marcus let out a sharp, barking laugh that turned heads at the nearby tables. Harper's Cove, that fishing village in Maine. What are you going to do? Elena live in that drafty old shack your Aunt Nora left you. Maybe grow carrots and raise chickens. He shook his head, his expression shifting to one of mock pity. You will be back in 6 months. You are not built for the simple life. You are a failure without the status I gave you. You will see. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a cruel whisper intended to shatter me. Besides, we need the space here. Tiffany is pregnant. That is why we are rushing things. We want the baby born in wedlock. He watched me closely, waiting for the tears. We had tried for years without success. He thought this was his victory lap, proving his virility and my inadequacy. I simply looked at him, at the cruelty etched into his handsome features. I hope the child is healthy, Marcus, I said softly. The waiter placed the leather bill folder on the table. Marcus snatched it up with a flourish, pulling out his platinum credit card. I have got this, he announced loudly enough for the next table to hear. Least I can do since you will be destitute. He handed the card over with a smirk. Moments later, the waiter returned, looking uncomfortable. I am sorry, sir. The card was declined. Marcus turned a shade of crimson I had never seen before. That is impossible, he snapped, avoiding my gaze. Run it again. It is your machine." He glared at the waiter until the man retreated. He pulled out a second card, his hand trembling slightly. The second time it went through, but the facade had cracked. I saw the sweat beading on his upper lip. He was leveraging everything he had to maintain an illusion of wealth. He signed the receipt aggressively and stood up, checking his watch. "I have to go. Tiffany is waiting." He marched out without a backward glance. I sat there for a moment longer. I watched his retreating back, the suit too tight, the stride too forced. I did not feel like a discarded wife. I felt like someone who had just stepped off a sinking ship onto dry land, watching the captain willingly chain himself to the anchor. The elevator ride up to the 42nd floor usually gave my ears a little pop, a reminder of how high we sat above the rest of Chicago. Tonight, the silence in the lift was deafening. When the doors slid open to reveal the penthouse, the space that Marcus and I had curated to be the envy of our social circle felt like a museum exhibit after closing hours. It was pristine, expensive, and completely devoid of life. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city lights, but the glass felt less like a window and more like the wall of a fishbowl. I walked straight to the master bedroom, pulling my battered leather suitcase from the back of the closet. It was the same bag I had brought with me to college, long before Marcus and his obsession with appearances had taken over my life. I began the process of separating my life from his. It was surprisingly easy. I opened the velvet jewelry box on the vanity. The diamond tennis bracelet he gave me after he forgot my birthday sat next to the sapphire pendant he bought when I found lipstick on his collar. I left them all. They were not gifts of love. They were payments for my silence. I moved to the walk-in closet. I ran my hand over the silk gowns and designer dresses that Marcus insisted I wear to his galas. They stayed, instead. I packed my worn flannel shirts, my comfortable jeans, and the thick wool sweaters I would need for the Maine coastline. Most importantly, I gathered my drafting tubes, my charcoal pencils, and the heavy sketchbooks filled with landscape designs I had drawn in secret late at night. These were the only things that truly belonged to me, buried under a stack of cashmere scarves. I found our wedding album. I hesitated for a fraction of a second before pulling it out. The leather cover was cool to the touch. I opened it to a random page. There we were, cutting the cake. Marcus smiling that perfect, practiced smile for the cameras. I looked at my own face in the photo. I looked young and hopeful, completely unaware that I was merely an accessory to his ambition. I did not feel the urge to cry. I simply closed the heavy book and dropped it into the metal wastebasket. It landed with a definitive thud. I was not just throwing away photos. I was discarding the version of myself that had allowed him to make me feel small. I stood back and looked at the closet one last time. The contrast was striking. My side was now nearly empty, stripped down to the bare essentials. Marcus's side was bursting at the seams. Rows of Italian suits, piles of silk ties, and shelves of shoes he rarely wore. It was a chaotic display of excess, a desperate attempt to fill a void that no amount of money could ever satisfy. It looked like the wardrobe of a man who was terrified of being ordinary. My empty shelves looked like peace. I walked back out to the kitchen island, the cold Carrara marble chilling my fingertips. I slipped the platinum wedding band off my finger. For 7 years, it had felt like a shackle. I placed it on the counter. Next to it, I set the house keys and a small slip of paper. On the paper, I had written the combination to the wall safe. It was the final handover. He could have the safe and whatever dwindling cash was inside. He would need it. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a number Marcus did not recognize. I answered it immediately. It was Mr. Henderson, my personal attorney, a man whose existence Marcus was completely unaware of. Mr. Henderson confirmed that the transfer of the title deeds and the trust fund activation was complete. The inheritance from Aunt Nora was fully secured under my maiden name, shielded by layers of legal protections that Marcus's budget lawyers would never penetrate. I thanked him and hung up. The secret I carried was no longer a burden. It was my armor. I took one final lap around the penthouse. I expected to feel a pang of loss for the luxury I was leaving behind. I waited for the fear of the unknown to grip me, but as I looked at the imported leather sofas and the abstract art we had bought just because it was expensive, I felt nothing but relief. I was not losing a home. I was escaping a cage. I grabbed the handle of my suitcase and walked to the door. The rhythmic click-clack of the suitcase wheels rolling over the hardwood floor echoed in the empty hallway. To anyone else, it was just the sound of luggage. To me, it sounded like the Liberty Bell. I opened the heavy front door and stepped out, letting it latch shut behind me with a solid, final click. I did not look back. The morning of the hearing. The Chicago sky was a bruised shade of gray, threatening rain that never quite fell. It was the kind of weather that usually made the city feel miserable, but as I walked up the limestone steps of the courthouse, I felt a clarity that bordered on euphoria. My internal weather was nothing but sunshine. I was not walking into a tragedy. I was walking toward an exit. Marcus arrived 10 minutes late, flanked by Tiffany. The spectacle they created was almost impressive in its lack of self-awareness. Tiffany was wearing a stark white dress that was tight enough to cut off circulation, clearly designed to show off the slight curve of her stomach while masquerading as bridal purity. She wore oversized sunglasses indoors, acting as if the dimly lit hallway of the family court was a paparazzi line at a Hollywood premiere. She clung to Marcus's arm like a barnacle, making a show of stroking her belly every time she thought I was looking. She whispered loudly in his ear and giggled, a performance designed entirely for an audience of one. If she expected me to crumble or lash out, she was disappointed. I just watched them with the detached fascination of a biologist observing a particularly odd mating ritual. Inside the courtroom, the proceedings were dry and clinical. When the judge, a weary-looking man with thick spectacles, asked about the division of assets, the room went silent. Marcus stiffened, his lawyers ready to fight for every appliance and piece of furniture. I simply stood up and spoke clearly. I told the judge I wanted nothing, no alimony, no claim on the penthouse, no share of his future earnings. I just wanted the divorce decree signed and stamped immediately. The relief on Marcus's face was instantaneous and insulting. He signed the papers with a flourish, the scratch of his pen echoing in the quiet room. As we stood up to leave, he leaned in close to me, his cologne overpowering in the stale air. He wore a look of triumphant pity. He whispered that I was a fool for walking away with nothing and that if I ever found myself starving, I could come beg him for some charity. He promised he would toss me a few dollars for old time's sake if I got on my knees. I stopped packing my bag and looked him directly in the eyes. I gave him a small, unreadable smile. I told him to keep every single cent because he was going to need it. For a split second, the arrogance faltered. A flicker of doubt crossed his face as he tried to decipher my tone, but it was quickly washed away by his own ego. We walked out of the courtroom and onto the sidewalk. The air was thick with humidity. Tiffany immediately started braying about their celebration plans. She spoke at a volume that guaranteed everyone within a 3-block radius could hear her. She was talking about booking the grand ballroom at the Majestic Hotel and flying to Paris to have a custom gown fitted. She rattled off brand names and 5-star ratings, casting sly glances in my direction to see if I was jealous of the life she had stolen. I did not have to wait for a taxi. A sleek, black luxury sedan pulled up to the curb, gliding silently to a halt. The back window rolled down to reveal Chloe, my best friend and fiercest ally. She looked at Marcus and Tiffany with a withering expression that could have peeled paint off a wall. She did not say a word to them. She simply held out a hand to me. As I climbed into the leather interior, Chloe handed me an envelope. Inside was a first-class ticket to Maine, departing in 3 hours. Through the tinted glass, I saw Marcus pause. He was staring at the car, his brow furrowed. He knew Chloe, but he also knew she was a freelance graphic designer who usually drove a beat-up hatchback. Seeing me step into a vehicle that cost more than his annual bonus clearly confused him. He took a half step toward us, his mouth opening to ask a question, but he never got the chance. Tiffany yanked on his arm, demanding to know if they could stop at the jewelry district before lunch. Marcus blinked, the confusion fading as he turned back to his high-maintenance prize. As the car pulled away into traffic, I watched them shrink in the rearview mirror until they were nothing but small, insignificant specks against the gray concrete of the city. The train ride north from Boston felt less like a commute and more like a shedding of skin. I sat by the window and watched the gray, suffocating concrete of the city slowly surrender to the landscape. The jagged skyline of skyscrapers, which had loomed over me like prison bars for years, dissolved into blurring lines of deep green pine forests. The scenery opened up, revealing the Atlantic Ocean, a vast and rhythmic expanse of blue that looked nothing like the contained, decorative water features Marcus loved so much. By the time the conductor announced our arrival at Harper's Cove, the constant, low-level hum of anxiety that lived in my chest had gone quiet. I stepped onto the platform and the air hit me immediately. It was not the recycled, conditioned air of the penthouse, nor the exhaust-choked smog of downtown Chicago. It was thick, cold, and tasted of salt and damp earth. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs until they ached in the most pleasant way possible. It felt like I was inhaling life itself. I took a local taxi to the address on the deed. Marcus had laughed when I mentioned moving here. He had pictured a rotting wooden shack with a leaking roof, a place where I would freeze and starve until I came crawling back to him. As the car crunched up the long gravel driveway, I felt a fierce spike of satisfaction. The house was not a shack. It was a majestic two-story structure built from gray river stone, perched stoically on a cliff that overlooked the churning bay. It looked timeless and unbreakable, surrounded by wild, overgrown rose bushes that climbed the walls like protective sentries. I unlocked the heavy oak front door and stepped inside. The house was silent, but it did not feel empty. It felt like it had been holding its breath, waiting for me to come home. I walked through the rooms, running my fingers over the smooth surfaces of warm oak furniture. Aunt Nora had not just left me a building. She had prepared a home. In the room facing the ocean, the afternoon light poured in through floor-to-ceiling windows. It was set up as a studio. There was a drafting table, fresh rolls of paper, and jars of high-quality pencils. She had remembered my passion even when I had let Marcus convince me it was a worthless hobby. I found the study on the ground floor. Sitting in the center of the desk was a thick envelope addressed to me in Nora's elegant, looping script. Inside was her will and a personal letter. My hands trembled as I read her words. She revealed the secret she had kept from everyone, especially the money-hungry vultures in our extended family. The house was just the surface. The documents detailed her ownership of a chain of luxury vacation properties along the coast and the commercial rights to the town boardwalk. I was not just the owner of a stone house. I was the silent landlord of half of Harper's Cove. I sank into the leather chair and wept. They were not tears of sadness. They were tears of overwhelming relief. I realized that while I was suffering in a cold marriage, my aunt had been quietly building a fortress of financial steel around me, ensuring that when I finally broke free, I would land on solid ground. Later that afternoon, I went out into the garden. I found a pair of rusty shears in the shed and began to work. I attacked the brambles and the dead branches with a fervor I did not know I possessed. Every snap of the blades felt like a release. I was cutting away the neglect. I was pruning the years of insults, the gaslighting, and the feeling of being small. I was clearing the rot to make way for new growth. That night, I slept in the master bedroom with the window cracked open. The sound of the waves crashing against the rocks below was a loud, rhythmic lullaby. For the first time in a decade, I did not wake up to the smell of stale scotch or the grating sound of Marcus snoring beside me. The bed was vast and cool. I stretched my limbs out, taking up as much space as I wanted. I closed my eyes and drifted off. wrapped in a blanket of peace that was more luxurious than any five-star hotel suite Marcus had ever booked. I could have easily spent the rest of my days sipping expensive tea on my terrace, living off the interest of the trust fund Aunt Nora left me. However, I refused to let my mind atrophy the way it had during my marriage. I needed purpose, not just comfort. I dusted off my portfolio and walked into the offices of North Coast Architects, the most respected firm in the county. I introduced myself as Elena Vance, dropping my married name and keeping the heavy weight of the Vanderhold legacy hidden. I wanted to be hired for my lines and my vision, not my bank account. They took me on as a junior associate, and for the first time in 7 years, I felt the electric thrill of earning my own keep. The rhythm of Harper's Cove was seductive. It did not have the frantic, caffeine-fueled panic of Chicago. Here, the local baker knew how I took my coffee not because he was trained to upsell me, but because he actually remembered me. I stopped wearing makeup as armor. I let my hair dry naturally in the salt air. I was no longer a trophy wife on a shelf. I was a neighbor, a colleague, and a friend. The artificiality of my old life peeled away like dead skin. My work became my sanctuary. When the firm took on the derelict Coastal Park project, I stayed late for 2 weeks straight. I drafted a design that utilized the natural erosion patterns rather than fighting them, creating a space that felt wild yet accessible. When I presented it to the senior partners, the room went silent. The director looked at me with new respect and told me I was leading the project starting the next morning. It was a victory that tasted sweeter than any gala dinner Marcus had ever dragged me to. The only intrusion from my past life came through Chloe. She was my spy behind enemy lines, calling me late at night with updates that were equal parts horrifying and hilarious. She told me Marcus was hemorrhaging money. He was spending nearly $200,000 on the floral arrangements alone, trying to project an image of unshakable prosperity. His company was losing contracts left and right, yet he was financing a wedding fit for royalty to convince the world he was still a king. It was a house of cards built in a hurricane, and he was adding more decks to the top. I began to socialize with the true elite of Maine. These were people who could buy and sell Marcus 10 times over, yet they drove 10-year-old trucks and wore flannel shirts to dinner. Real wealth. I learned, did not scream. It whispered. It was at a small, understated art exhibition that I met Arthur Sterling. He was a man in his 60s with sharp blue eyes that missed nothing. We were both admiring a watercolor of the harbor when he struck up a conversation about the use of negative space. After 20 minutes of discussing art and local politics, he tilted his head and looked at me closely. He asked if I was related to Nora Vanderhold. When I nodded, admitting she was my aunt, his face softened into a genuine smile. He told me he had admired her tenacity for decades. Then, his expression turned mischievous. He revealed that he knew exactly who my ex-husband was. Apparently, Marcus had been bombarding his office with desperate proposals, begging for a meeting to secure an investment that would save his sinking company. We spent the rest of the evening drinking cheap white wine and talking about the difference between price and value. Arthur told me that he could smell desperation on a man like cheap cologne, and Marcus reeked of it. He was impressed that I had chosen to build a life here with my own hands rather than resting on my inheritance. By the time I walked home that night, the cold ocean breeze felt invigorating. I caught my reflection in a shop window and hardly recognized the woman staring back. She was not the pale, shrinking ghost who had fled Chicago. She was vibrant, she was capable, and for the first time in her life, she was formidable. 1 week before the spectacle was set to begin, my phone lit up with a video call from Chloe. When I answered, the background behind her was the chaotic interior of a bridal salon, but she was hiding in what looked like a supply closet. She looked exhausted. She told me that Tiffany was currently in the main showroom screaming at a poor seamstress because the shade of silk on the bridesmaids' dresses was apparently eggshell instead of ivory. According to Chloe, the staff was terrified, and the wedding planner had been seen crying in the bathroom twice that morning. It sounded like a circus, and Tiffany was the ringmaster from hell. Chloe lowered her voice. bringing the phone closer to her face. The news she had about Marcus was even darker. To fund this carnival of vanity, Marcus had completely lost his mind. He had drained the company's emergency reserve fund down to zero. That was not enough, so he had gone to private lenders for high-interest bridge loans. He was spending nearly $50,000 just on a dress that Tiffany claimed was encrusted with crushed diamonds. He had hired a 60-piece symphony orchestra because Tiffany said a DJ was too low class. He was burning through cash he did not have, gambling his entire future on the hope that this wedding would impress enough wealthy guests to bail him out of his financial hole. The rumors in the Chicago business district were vicious. Chloe told me that everyone knew Marcus was standing on the edge of a cliff. His company had not landed a significant contract in 6 months, and his creditors were starting to get restless. Yet, here he was, throwing a party that cost more than the gross domestic product of a small island nation. He was trying to fake it until he made it, but the facade was cracking. Chloe also mentioned seeing Tiffany in the hallway of the hotel, hissing into her cell phone. She was arguing with someone about money, her face pale and sweaty. She had looked panicked, but Marcus was too busy shouting at the caterers about the lobster bisque to notice that his bride was hiding a secret of her own. 2 days later, Arthur Sterling called me. I was in my garden, deadheading the hydrangeas, when I picked up. Arthur sounded amused, his voice rich with suppressed laughter. He told me that he had received a gold-embossed invitation to the wedding. Marcus, in his desperation to find new investors, had invited every high-net-worth individual in the tri-state area, regardless of whether he actually knew them. Arthur said he was going to attend. He told me he had a morbid curiosity to see the man who had been foolish enough to let me go. I felt a knot of anxiety tighten in my stomach. I asked Arthur to please just be a guest. I told him to drink the expensive champagne, eat the gold leaf cake, and leave without causing a scene. I did not want to be the reason for any drama. Arthur chuckled, a low sound that vibrated through the phone line. He told me he would behave exactly as the situation required, which was a non-answer if I ever heard one. He wished me a good afternoon and hung up, leaving me with a lingering sense of foreboding. That evening, I sat on my porch with my laptop. A notification popped up from the private bank managing Aunt Nora's trust. The quarterly dividend had just been deposited into my account. I stared at the screen, blinking to make sure I was seeing the digits correctly. The amount was staggering. In a single transfer, I had received a sum that was 10 times larger than what Marcus earned in an entire year of clawing and scratching his way up the corporate ladder. I looked at the number, and I felt absolutely no urge to hoard it. I opened a new tab and navigated to the website for the Harper's Cove Public Library. They had been fundraising for a new children's reading wing for 3 years. I typed in a donation amount that covered the entire remaining balance of their goal. When I clicked confirm, a warmth spread through my chest that had nothing to do with the tea I was drinking. It was the joy of true abundance. While Marcus was drowning in debt to buy an illusion of happiness, I was using my reality to build something that would last. I closed my laptop, listening to the crickets chirping in the tall grass, and felt a profound sense of peace. The storm was brewing in Chicago, but here, the air was clear. The reception was taking place at the Majestic Hotel, a venue known for its understated elegance, but Marcus and Tiffany had managed to turn it into a carnival of grotesque opulence. I was sitting in my garden in Maine, wrapped in a knitted blanket with a cup of chamomile tea warming my hands. Propped up against a terracotta pot was my phone, streaming a live video feed from Chloe. She was attending as the +1 of her husband, whose small printing firm did business with Marcus, giving her the perfect cover to be my eyes and ears inside the belly of the beast. The scene on my small screen looked like a parody of a royal wedding directed by someone with zero taste and an unlimited line of credit. The first thing Chloe showed me was a 6-foot-tall ice sculpture in the center of the room. It was carved in the likeness of Marcus and Tiffany embracing, but the heat of the room was already making them weep copious amounts of water, turning Marcus's icy jawline into a slushy puddle. The floor was not just carpeted, it was buried under a layer of red rose petals so thick that the waiters were struggling to push their carts through the floral drifts. Chloe zoomed in on the menu card at her table. It was literally plated in gold leaf. I could practically smell the desperation through the pixels. Tiffany made her entrance looking less like a bride and more like a jewelry store display case. She was wearing a necklace that looked heavy enough to cause spinal damage and a tiara that sat awkwardly on her hair. Despite the sparkle, she looked terrified. Every time a guest approached her with a congratulatory envelope, she snatched it with a speed that bordered on feral. Her eyes darted around the room, not with joy, but with the frantic energy of a cornered animal checking for exits. She kept touching her stomach, not in a maternal way, but as if reminding herself of the lie that had gotten her this far. Marcus was working the room with the manic energy of a game show host. I watched him slap backs and shake hands, his laugh too loud and too long. I could hear him bragging to a group of bored-looking businessmen about his global empire and his new wife's aristocratic lineage. He was spinning a fantasy about Tiffany being the heiress to a European shipping fortune, a lie so transparent that I saw two of the guests exchange knowing, mocking glances. The room was buzzing, but not with admiration. The guests were whispering behind their champagne flutes, sharing rumors about unpaid invoices and bounced checks. They were not there to celebrate a union. They were there to witness a train wreck, and the free lobster was just a bonus. Then, the camera shifted as a hush fell over the entrance. Arthur Sterling had arrived. He walked in with a quiet dignity that made the rest of the room look cheap. Marcus spotted him instantly. He practically sprinted across the room, nearly tripping over the rose petals in his haste. I watched as Marcus threw his arms open, loud enough for the microphone to pick up, and announced to the room that his dearest friend and mentor, Arthur Sterling, had graced them with his presence. It was a bold lie, considering they had never met face to face. Arthur did not smile. He did not extend his hand. He simply looked at Marcus with an expression of icy indifference. He sidestepped Marcus's attempted hug with the grace of a matador avoiding a clumsy bull. Arthur walked straight past the groom and the head table. He chose a seat at a large circular table right in the center of the room, directly next to the podium where the master of ceremonies had left the microphone. It was a strategic position. Marcus looked confused for a moment, his smile faltering, but he quickly recovered and pretended that this snub was just a quirky inside joke between billionaires. I took a sip of my tea, the warm steam rising into the cool Maine air. The contrast between my serene reality and the chaotic circus on my screen was jarring. It felt like I was watching a dark comedy, the kind where you know the characters are driving toward a cliff, but they are too busy looking in the mirror to notice the road running out. I sat back, the ocean breeze rustling the leaves around me, and waited for the final act to begin. The speeches had been dragging on for 20 minutes, a parade of generic compliments and forced laughter, when the atmosphere in the ballroom suddenly shifted. On my screen, I saw Arthur Sterling stand up from the center table. He did not ask for permission. He simply walked over to the master of ceremonies, who looked too intimidated to object, and took the microphone from his hand. The room went quiet, but Marcus looked ecstatic. He clearly believed that this was the moment his fabricated friendship with Arthur would be validated in front of his doubters. He stood up, clapping his hands aggressively, and gestured for the band to stop playing. He beamed at the crowd, practically shouting that everyone needed to pay attention to the wisdom of his distinguished guest. Arthur waited for the applause to die down. He did not smile. His voice was steady, deep, and carried a weight that cut through the frivolous energy of the room like a knife. He began by speaking about his recent travels to the coast of Maine. He described the beauty of Harper's Cove with a reverence that seemed out of place at a Chicago wedding. Then, he shifted his focus to business. He spoke of a meeting he had with the heir to the Vanderhold dynasty, a name that meant nothing to Marcus but clearly rang a bell for several of the older, wealthier guests in the room. Arthur described the estate in detail. He mentioned the stone mansion on the cliff. He listed the portfolio of vacation properties. He casually mentioned that the commercial rights to the harbor tourism alone were valued at tens of millions of dollars. At the mention of the money, Marcus's eyes widened. I could see the greed flaring up in his expression, mixed with confusion. He looked at Tiffany, who shrugged, clearly wondering why this old man was giving a real estate report in the middle of her wedding. The entire room was silent now, hanging on every word. They were captivated by the description of this mysterious, wealthy woman who commanded such respect from a titan like Arthur Sterling. Then Arthur delivered the strike. He looked directly at the head table and spoke clearly. He said that this impressive young woman, who held the deed to one of the most valuable private estates on the East Coast, went by the name of Elena. He paused for a heartbeat before adding that she was the very same woman who had been sitting across from Marcus in divorce court just a few days ago. The reaction was instantaneous. A collective gasp rippled through the room, followed by a wave of hushed, frantic whispering. On the screen, Marcus turned a color that I had never seen on a human being before. It was a draining of blood so severe that his skin looked like gray ash. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The champagne flute in his hand tilted dangerously. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. The woman he had mocked for being destitute, the wife he had discarded because he thought she was holding him back from the high life, was actually the golden ticket he had spent his entire life searching for. Arthur was not finished. He leaned into the microphone, his voice dropping to a tone of pity that must have felt like acid to Marcus's ego. He told Marcus that it was a tragedy to watch a man throw away a flawless, genuine diamond just so he could chase after a handful of cheap plastic glitter. Beside Marcus, Tiffany began to panic. She tugged violently on his sleeve, her eyes wide with fear as she tried to pull him back to reality, urging him to stop the old man from talking. But Marcus did not move. He was catatonic. He stared blankly ahead, his eyes glazed over. I knew exactly what was happening in his mind. He was not thinking about his bride or his wedding. He was running the numbers in his head, calculating the tens of millions of dollars he had just let slip through his fingers because of his own arrogance. It was the face of a man who realized he had just bankrupted his own soul. The room was still reeling from the revelation about my wealth when Arthur turned his gaze toward Tiffany. He did not look at her with anger. He regarded her with the boredom of an auditor finding a math error. He spoke into the microphone again. "And by the way, Miss Tiffany, regarding that personal loan application for $50,000 you submitted to my bank branch this morning, it was declined." The gasp that went through the hall this time was sharp and violent. The facade of the billionaire heiress shattered instantly. Arthur continued, his voice relentless. He announced to the entire room that Tiffany was not a socialite. She was a compulsive gambler who was drowning in debt and living on maxed-out credit cards. He revealed that her family fortune was a fabrication. Marcus spun around to face his bride. His neck veins were bulging. "You applied for a loan," he screamed, his voice cracking. "You told me your parents were millionaires. You told me they were wiring us a wedding gift next week. Arthur was not finished delivering the autopsy of their relationship." He interrupted Marcus's interrogation with one final devastating truth. "Her parents are currently renting a basement apartment in a rough neighborhood in New Jersey. And as for the child you are rushing to marry for, well, our credit checks include medical underwriting for insurance purposes." According to her records, Miss Tiffany underwent a procedure 3 years ago that makes natural conception statistically impossible. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the silence of a bomb having detonated, with the dust settling over the ruins. The double deception lay bare for everyone to see. The wife he had discarded for being boring and poor, was a hidden millionaire. Tiffany, the woman he had destroyed his marriage for, was a destitute con artist. Marcus snapped. It was instantaneous and violent. He swung his arm out, smashing into the tower of champagne glasses beside the cake. The crash of hundreds of crystal flutes shattering on the floor sounded like a gunshot. He did not care. He lunged at Tiffany, grabbing her wrist with a force that made me wince even through the screen. "Is it true?" he roared, shaking her. "Is there a baby? Tell me." Tiffany was hyperventilating. Her mascara was running down her cheeks in black streaks. She tried to pull away, but he held fast. "I had to," she shrieked, her voice shrill and terrified. "I bought the positive test online. I needed the ring. Marcus, I have sharks coming after me for the money. I thought you were rich. I thought you could pay them off." "I am broke because of you," Marcus screamed back, his voice tearing from his throat. "I spent everything I had on this circus because you said your father would reimburse me." The realization hit them both at the same time. They were two parasites who had latched onto each other, hoping to suck the other dry, only to realize they were both starving. Marcus released her arm and she stumbled back into the waiter, sending a tray of appetizers flying. He looked around the room, at the shocked faces of his colleagues, at the sneering investors, and finally at the empty spot where his dignity used to be. He grabbed his hair with both hands and let out a scream of pure, unadulterated despair. He had lost the woman who could have given him the world, and he had chained himself to an anchor that was dragging him straight to the bottom. The majestic hotel ballroom had devolved into a gladiatorial arena. Through the small screen of my phone, I watched the final vestiges of Marcus's sanity crumble. He was not just shouting anymore. He was destroying everything within reach. He overturned a table, sending fine china and crystal crashing into the untouched entrees. Tiffany was on her knees, her white dress stained with wine and tears, begging him to stop, but her pleas only seemed to fuel his rage. The guests had abandoned all pretense of politeness. They stood on chairs and crowded the edges of the dance floor, holding their phones high to capture every second of the humiliation. The live stream count on Chloe's feed was skyrocketing, broadcasting their downfall to the world in real time. Hotel security swarmed the room within seconds. 3 burly guards tackled Marcus just as he raised a fist toward Tiffany. They pinned him face down onto the rose-petal-covered floor, his tuxedo jacket tearing at the seams. It was then that the chaos deepened. A group of men in ill-fitting suits, whom everyone had assumed were distant relatives, stepped forward from the crowd. They were not guests. They were creditors. They started shouting over the noise, announcing to anyone who would listen that Marcus's company had been legally bankrupt for over a month, and that this wedding was nothing more than an attempt to defraud investors. They waved legal notices in the air, turning the romantic event into a crime scene investigation. Chloe kept her camera steady, narrating the arrival of the police with the cool detachment of a war correspondent. I watched as they hauled Marcus to his feet. He looked broken, his hair wild and his eyes vacant, as the officers cuffed his hands behind his back. The charges were being listed loudly by the creditors' disorderly conduct, assault, and significant financial fraud. As they dragged him out through the service exit to avoid the paparazzi gathering at the front, Arthur Sterling paused near Chloe. He looked directly into the camera lens, knowing exactly who was watching on the other side. He gave a single, deliberate wink, adjusted his silk tie, and walked calmly out of the ballroom, leaving the wreckage behind him without a backward glance. The screen went black as Chloe ended the stream. The silence that followed was heavy, but it was not oppressive. It was the silence of a storm that had finally blown itself out. I sat there in the dark garden, listening to the rhythmic sound of the waves crashing against the cliffs below and the steady chirping of crickets in the tall grass. I waited for the rush of vindication. I checked my pulse for the thrill of revenge. It was not there. Instead, I felt a profound, settling calm. It was the feeling of watching a fire burn down to cold ash, knowing it could never burn you again. The anger, the hurt, and the resentment had all evaporated, leaving only a quiet indifference. I placed my phone on the wooden table and held the power button until the screen turned off completely. I stood up and walked to the edge of the balcony, inhaling the sharp, cold air of the Atlantic. It smelled of salt and pine and freedom. I did not care what happened to Marcus or Tiffany tomorrow. Their fate was their own creation. My reality was here. I had a sunrise to catch. I had a meeting with the town council at 9 in the morning to discuss the drainage systems for the new coastal park project. I had a life to build, one that was solid and real and entirely mine. I smiled, a genuine expression that reached my eyes. I picked up my mug of tea, turned my back on the ocean, and stepped inside the warm, stone house. I closed the heavy oak door firmly behind me, shutting out the noise of the world forever. Thank you so much for listening to my story. I would love to know where you are tuning in from today, so please leave a comment below, sharing your location and your thoughts on how this ended. If you enjoyed this story, please make sure to subscribe to the Lily Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and hit that hype button to help us share these stories with even more people.